welcome to Daily Interlake News Now. I'm your host, Taylor Inman. We're taking a look at some of last week's biggest headlines and what's coming up for the Flathead Valley. This week, we're taking a deep dive into Glacier National Park's Headwaters podcast with producers and hosts Michael Faist and Peri Sasnett. Trending in the top 10 of Apple Podcasts nature charts, Michael and Peri tell us about how they approach each new season and find exciting ways to tell the stories of everything from fire lookouts to the fur trade in Glacier. But first, here's some headlines. Local airport officials are hoping that the U.S. Senate will vote to stop new Transportation Security Administration rules that would require airports to perform additional screening on employees. Montana Senator Jon Tester, a Democrat, recently attached an amendment to the Homeland Security funding bill that would delay the policy's implementation, according to spokesperson Harry Child. The bill passed the Senate Appropriations Committee and is awaiting a full Senate vote. The TSA rule, which is set to go into effect September 25th, would require airport operators to set up and pay for an independent security checkpoint to screen airport employees. Glacier Park International Airport Director Rob Rutkowski said that he and other airport administrators across Montana lobbied the state's congressional delegation to block the rules. Rutkowski described the proposed rules as a fundamental shift in how airport security is handled. He said that the current airport policies require background checks and ID badges for employees that enter sensitive areas of the airport. Other employees, such as those working in restaurants or gift shops, are subject to TSA screening when going to work. He said that the TSA's mandate to secure airports is clear, and that shifting the burden to airports isn't practical due to logistical and financial constraints. Tester's spokesperson said that in addition to writing the amendment, the senator is urging TSA officials to not implement the policy. The Center for Asbestos Related Disease in Libby filed for bankruptcy in federal court last Monday, just months after a jury ruled that it had submitted hundreds of false claims on behalf of patients. The Chapter 11 filing will allow the clinic, which is often referred to by its acronym CARD, to continue to operate and serve its patients, according to Board Chair Leroy Tom. Tom said in an interview with the Western News that, quote, "To the best of my understanding, it protects CARD funds so we can continue to operate and take care of our patients and prevent the railroad from cleaning us out," end quote. The board decided July 28th to authorize Executive Director Tracy McNew to retain the Billings firm of Patton, Peterman, Beckedahl, and Green to represent it in the bankruptcy. Attorneys will also represent the clinic in a hearing later this month to determine if an ombudsman is required to monitor the quality of patient care and to represent the interests of patients at the healthcare business. The hearing is set for 9 a.m. August 30th in the bankruptcy courtroom in the Russell Smith Courthouse in Missoula in front of U.S. District Judge Benjamin Hirsch. Also, a meeting of creditors in which a CARD representative must be present is set for 10 a.m. September 14th. CARD has been battered over the last month or so after a federal jury ruled that it submitted 337 false patient claims, making people eligible for Medicare and other benefits they shouldn't have received. The jury said 246 violations occurred before November 2, 2015, and 91 after that date. BNSF Railway, on behalf of the U.S. government, brought the suit in 2019 under the False Claims Act. The act allows private parties to sue on behalf of the federal government. BNSF, which is in itself a defendant in hundreds of asbestos-related lawsuits, argued the center submitted claims on behalf of patients without sufficient confirmation that they had asbestos-related disease. A roughly $300,000 infusion of federal funds from the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law will support Glacier National Park's efforts in restoring natural habitats and addressing the effects of climate change. A portion of the funding will initiate studies in cooperation with the Blackfeet Nation and other partners to monitor and analyze environmental conditions associated with the reintroduction of bison adjacent to the park. As part of the tribally led Any initiative, the Blackfeet Nation released a small herd of bison from its captive herd into the Chief Mountain area of the Blackfeet Reservation. The Any initiative is a collaboration to restore free-ranging bison to the landscape after a 125-year absence. Any in the Blackfeet language means free-ranging bison. Both Glacier National Park and Waterton Lakes National Park are participants in the initiative. About $750,000 of Inflation Reduction Act funds will go to 9 parks, including Glacier, while an additional $99,500 from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill will go to Great Glacier, Yellowstone, and Grand Teton National Parks for projects to restore the threatened whitebark pine and to implement the National Whitebark Pine Restoration Strategy. The project includes working with partners and tribes to plant blister rust-resistant seeds and seedlings, identify rust-resistant trees, monitor seedling survival, and identify climate refugia. The project builds on 20 years of work at Glacier National Park and within the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. The acts will provide a total of $52 million to the National Park Service to fund projects throughout the country related to ecosystem resilience, restoration, and environmental planning needs. Additionally, Inflation Reduction Act funding will be used to assess the climate change vulnerability of water supplies throughout Glacier National Park in an effort to increase their security and sustainability, develop adaptation strategies, and inform investment decisions. Through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act, the National Park Service is working to address impacts of the climate crisis, including intensifying droughts, wildfires, flooding, and legacy pollution in national parks and other public lands. I joined Headwaters hosts and producers Michael Faist and Peri Sasnett on a smoky August morning near Apgar to talk about their public radio-style podcast. Headwaters has 3 seasons under its belt, each taking a new approach to telling the stories of Glacier National Park. Good morning. I'm here with Michael and Peri. They are the producers and hosts of Headwaters. It's an educational podcast about Glacier National Park. And they're here to tell me a little bit about how they make the podcast, how it came to be, and all that good stuff. So, yeah, thanks for joining me, guys.
Great to be here.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah. So, I thought a good place to start would be, could you kind of tell me how the project came to be?
Sure. So in 2020, we launched Headwaters after a few years of scheming. So our colleague Daniel saw that Yellowstone had started experimenting with the podcast format in a show called Telemetry. And they were some short, well-edited stories about science happening in Yellowstone. And so Daniel thought, why couldn't we do that here? Lots of people listen to podcasts every day. It's such a powerful tool for telling stories, and we just haven't done it before. So that was kind of the inspiration of seeing other parks starting to experiment with it. And so Daniel sent a grant application into the Glacier National Park Conservancy. Mm-hmm. They also thought it was a great idea. And then in 2020, we started working on it.
What were each of you guys doing before you got involved with the podcast?
I was working in a similar position in the Tetons, doing science communication and digital media work. So kind of, telling science stories at another park. Mm-hmm. And I had done video, I'd done writing, I had done photography, other kind of multimedia work, but not much audio. So the podcast element was new to me, but the sort of storytelling was something I had already been doing for a while.
Yeah, I worked here as an interpretive ranger, leading guided hikes, campground talks, worked in the winters leading snowshoe programs for kids. So my job here had always been telling stories about the park to people who were new here or were returning visitors. And then when I heard they were going to start working on a podcast, I just started hounding our colleague Daniel. It's like, you should hire me. I can tell a story. So it worked.
Enthusiasm.
Yeah. Persistence, enthusiasm. So I think that helped having a background of being an interpretive ranger here, because it wasn't our first seasons when we started working on Headwaters in Glacier. We had the background of getting to know the place, getting to know what others are interested in learning about, and what people already know about Glacier, what's commonly told in these campground talks and guided hikes.
Yeah, definitely.
And I had worked here in 2017 and 18 as well. So I had gone back to the Tetons, but I did have some familiarity with Glacier and kind of Glacier stories. So that helped a lot.
Yeah, I think science communication can be kind of tricky. But you guys already have kind of a little bit of a base knowledge of a lot of the stuff here in the park. When you encounter something that you don't know about, where you have to kind of dig into it, can you just tell me about an experience maybe where you've had to do that?
That's the best part.
Yeah,
I know.
It is the most fun.
For me, what I love about this job is that I get to learn a little bit or a medium amount about so many different topics, whether it's whitebark pine, whether it's the history of the fur trade, whether it's, all these different things that I'd heard of. I knew a little bit about whitebark pine, but once we started researching that season, it was like, okay, we find academic papers that are published about it. We're going to talk to other experts, sort of pre-interviews, not necessarily for the show, but just call up people who know about this and see if they can answer our questions. ask them who else we should talk to. That's been really fruitful. It's because, we can start with a certain amount of people we know who are experts on these things, but they know way more people. So that's been a really good way of getting connected to different people who can fill in different parts of the story, whether it's, people from the Forest Service or tribal members or just people who happen to have been involved with something for a long time and know the history of it.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, this job shares, with interpretive rangers who are creating programs that they give to the public. Everybody who works here in interpretation is researching stories that they want to learn more about. This job just has the benefit of giving us the leeway and time. If we don't know something, we can invite ourselves into the field with the people doing the work. You go to the counter assault bear spray factory and get a tour. It just kind of arms us with the time and the encouragement to seek out those experts where they're working and hear from them directly.
So could you guys tell me a little bit about how you go about researching the episodes?
Sure. Well, most of the stories we select, or most of the stories we find ourselves interested in, are stories that haven't been told well here already. And so usually that means there isn't a ton of information around on the subject, but it takes a lot of digging, whether that's through the park archives with the help of our archives staff. Folks in the archives and library and cultural resources have been wonderful resources in helping direct our interests and connecting us with different resources. In season 1, I was interested in looking at the history of fire lookouts, and I had heard that Edward Abbey spent a summer at Numa Ridge in the North Fork. And I reached out to Jean, who works in the archives, and she replied with hey, there are a few things from his time, but there's actually another really interesting story about a woman who worked here in the 50s that has these letters that are just so charming. And so that's just one of many examples of the entire story became about that woman. Her name was Kay Rosengren instead of Edward Abbey. So step 1 is just figure out what resources we have, talk with the people here that have connections to them. But beyond that, there's a lot of other resource avenues too. Do you want to expand on it?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, of course, there's the published literature, there's books out there, and I think we all really appreciate the time that we have to work on this project because we have a whole summer basically to make a season. So we can actually read books about our topics. Also, good old internet deep dive. I was researching the fur trade episode from the history season and found, a genealogy of the main character that we were working on, going all the way back to sort of some of the earliest kind of founding fathers of New York City. And it was just I don't know who put this together, but it was amazing to be able to find that from this person that to me was this obscure fur trader here in Montana in the late 1800s. So just finding connections like that and the things you can dig up are very fun.
Honestly, one of the best approaches to researching these stories has been learning enough to know who you need to talk to, and then interviewing them, because they'll give you what you need. They will be able to point you to different sources, and it makes your whole job much easier to be able to bounce your knowledge off of this person who's been studying this for 50 years or just knows the topic inside and out. And working on a story about railroad labor history, I learned that the Daily Interlake was the first paper ever founded in the valley in the town of Demersville that doesn't exist anymore.
I didn't know that.
Just you come across all sorts of little facts.
You join experts in the field quite a bit to make episodes, and it must be tough carrying around all that equipment. Can you tell me a little bit about how you navigate that?
Well, as someone who's also done a lot of video work, I will say the audio gear is lighter than a video camera and a tripod, but it's not insignificant, especially if you're doing an overnight trip and already have all your gear. You never really want to load all those extra batteries and recorders and stuff in there, but yeah, the whitebark pine season had a lot of field work, and so we spent a lot of time chasing up hills after different
and never
crews.
field work that happened somewhere like level, lovely, like a valley floor here at Lake
Whitebark pine don't grow there.
They grow in the
so
mountains,
they're
and
at
you've
the
got to
top of the
schlep
hill.
up a steep slope, often without access to a trail, to look for Clark's nutcrackers, to look for whitebark pine cones. And
we went up Mount Brown twice in like 3 weeks, once with our fire ecologist and once with the re-veg crew. And so, we're all the way up, like past the lookout, and we're like, so this field work must be pretty intense. And they're like, like there's a trail for this one. Sometimes there's not even a trail, and those get crazy. I was like, okay. They're schlepping all this stuff up there and swinging their tools to plant the little pine seedlings. So
I've been grateful for all the field work we've had a chance to do over the years, because I've kind of positioned myself as the team pack mule, and I will
he just wants to go everywhere,
justify
and do everything.
being my presence on like overnight backpacking trips because I'm carrying all the stuff.
That's
And we appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, speaking of whitebark pine, so the first season, could you explain a little bit of what you focused on the first season, and then we'll jump into whitebark pine?
Yeah. So for season 1, the idea for the podcast was to take a kind of park-wide view and make an episode on each major entrance to the park to help people get familiar, not just with kind of the practical trip planning things that you'd need to know going into Lake McDonald or Many Glacier, but stories that capture the character of those places and the people who work there. And so that came out in December of 2020. But when we had finished, my co-host at the time, Andrew, who now works for the Glacier Conservancy, and our colleague Daniel, we all met and started talking about, what do we want to do next year? We don't want to just do the same thing every summer, and we want to try something new. And at the time, Daniel and Andrew both were keeping a close eye on conversations around whitebark pine. A lot of work happens here in Glacier and around us in the National Forest and with the CSKT reservation, indicating that whitebark was going to be listed under the Endangered Species Act in some capacity soon. And so we thought it was a really great opportunity to try to get ahead of it, talk to the people doing that work that could lead to an Endangered Species Act listing, and that did lead to an Endangered Species Act listing. It's now listed as threatened. And we put that together summer of 2021 in preparation for that, so it would come out around the same time. So that was the idea behind why whitebark for our second season. But there's much more to say about how we actually did it if we wanted to get into that.
Yeah, tell me about how you approach that, because it's kind of hard to, no pun intended, to branch out. It's so it's just like one species of tree. How did you decide what to talk about?
Well, yeah, I think, like you said, we always kind of want to be doing something new, and so it was very different. It was a big shift to go from doing 7 episodes each about a different part of the park to 5 episodes that are a single story. So we thought a lot about how do you approach that? How do you break that down? How do you make each episode feel like there's an arc and there's a beginning, middle, and an end, but then also that they all connect together? So, we kind of frame them around the questions that we're asking. So, the episode 1 is, why is this tree important? Why does it matter? And then we went into more of the ecology, scientifically, ecologically, how does it matter? How's it connected to other things in this ecosystem? Why is it threatened? Why is it in trouble? Then what are we doing about it? And then episode 5 was kind of, what does this all mean? What's the bigger picture here? What does this mean for conservation more broadly? And so those questions kind of drove each episode and who we talked to and how we put those together. But then thematically, we wanted, these themes running through the whole season about, generations. This is a generations-long project. It stretches into the past. It stretches into the future. That this is a big, so interdisciplinary, so interagency. It was, season 1 was very much in the park, and season 2 was very much beyond the park. Certainly there's tons of whitebark pine here, and we talked to a lot of people who are working in the park, but also people, restoring whitebark on Big Mountain with the Forest Service. Mm-hmm. We visited an ancient whitebark pine tree called Alauya on the Flathead Reservation with a CSKT forester. So it was cool to be able to go beyond the bounds of the park. I mean, you talked to people from the East Coast.
Yeah. Honestly, one of the challenges internally was just we went from doing 7 episodes on different places and all these little different stories. I had to be convinced that 5 episodes on one thing, a tree, was going to be that interesting to listen to or to even work on. And so one of the things I think we consciously did from the beginning was look for ways that, not everyone might know what whitebark pine is and might not, when they see that the season's all about this one tree, be super interested. But we wanted to find creative ways to demonstrate the relevance of this story to people's lives, whether they're here or somewhere else. One of the ways we did it was by looking at other trees that had shared a similar path of once all over the place, really important, and had disappeared. And American chestnut trees were a story that kept coming up in our research, and when we talked to experts. It's like the death of American chestnuts on the East Coast in Appalachia is kind of the worst case scenario for what could happen to whitebark. And so using that as an excuse to take time out of our episode to tell that story. Short, 20 minutes, but helps demonstrate the stakes of what we're working on here, and also reaches out to a new audience that might not have been interested otherwise.
Because the question is always kind of, how do you make this relevant to people? How do you make people want to listen? How do you get people to connect to Glacier and to this place, which I'm sure plenty of our listeners have been here, but I'm sure plenty haven't. And so to be able to make these broader connections with a tree that was on the East Coast and throughout the eastern part of the U.S. just kind of broadens the scope of what we're talking about, and helps people to connect with the story that we're telling.
There's so many dense technical questions that come up with whitebark management too, surrounding genetic conservation, looking at the genome of this tree and planning for a future impacted by climate change. It can be really abstract, and trees are very charismatic, but they don't have the same pull sometimes that other things like mammals do. And so we tried to, again, tackle that genetic conservation topic by looking at the story of black-footed ferrets, this critically endangered species that, with the help of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, was recently cloned. And so that is a hook. That's interesting, and that helps us explain what is happening with whitebark too. And so that's another example of searching for little stories, because the whole season is about a tree, but we use it to explore a lot of different big questions about conservation and our place in public lands, using these little tangents.
So we're digging into history. The 3rd season is the one that came out this summer, or when did they come out?
This spring.
The spring?
Spring or early summer.
Okay, and we're focusing on history. Can you tell me a little bit more about this previous season?
Yeah, so season 3 was kind of a pre-park history, kind of looking at stories leading up to the formation of the park in 1910. So we told stories about the Pleistocene, we told stories about Lewis and Clark, the fur trade, the railroad, just trying to dig into some of these stories that are less told. I think there's a lot of narratives that we all know about how the park came to be and why it looks the way it does today. But we wanted to add some stories to that we thought were interesting that aren't as well known.
Yeah, so much of the storytelling that, in my experience as a park ranger, we do about the history of this place begins with the fact that, we're on the traditional lands of the Salish, Kootenai, Kalispé, and Amskapi Piikani people. And then beyond that, we start at park history. The building of Going to the Sun Road, Great Northern Railroad marketing this place as a park and getting that established. And then everything beyond 1910 when the park was founded. So this was a exercise in trying to set the stage, set the table, assemble all of these little all the context for how this park came to be in the first place. And a lot of the stories we told in season 3, they did extend after the park was founded. But
yeah, that was amazing to me, was how, because I think because a few other members of our team worked over the winter researching some of the stories. And so we came in May like, all right, we're ready to go. It's like, all right, history before the park. And we're like, are all these stories from the 1800s or from 10,000 years ago? Are they going to be relevant? Is there going to be anyone to interview? How are they going to tie it to today?
Certainly don't have any videos to use, audio from, or no newspapers from 10,000 years ago.
Right. All our sort of primary sources are dead. But it was amazing, like at every turn, how relevant things were.
So how did you supplement the, normally you'd go interview somebody, you'd get, photos, video. How did you supplement that?
So we did it in a few ways. So we talked to experts. There's plenty of historians who study this time period.
Sure.
And we could interview them about their thoughts. We read from primary sources like journals and reports and stuff like that, and we actually worked with some voice actors to read some of those. We also worked with people who it's relevant to them today. One of my highlights was getting to interview Sheldon Johnson, who many people will probably remember from Ken Burns's National Parks documentary. It came out 10 years ago, 15 years ago, the America's Best Idea series. And the episode was about the Buffalo Soldiers here in Glacier, and their exploration of the park and crossing Ahern Pass. And he works in Yosemite, but he reenacts a buffalo soldier, and he does interpretive programs and kind of living history, and has done a ton of research into that and written a lot of first-person narratives based on his own research as a buffalo soldier, and performs those. And so that was a way to bring that history to life that it would never have occurred to me that would exist for something that happened so long ago. But it was a really cool experience.
That's a great resource.
Yeah, it was amazing.
Because any question we had about, what would have brought a Black American U.S. Army soldier to Montana in the first place,
what
Sheldon
might
could
have
answer.
been like. Yeah. He had an answer for all of it.
Super valuable.
Right.
So what are you guys thinking about for next year's season? If you can give us a sneak peek.
Well, as we've mentioned, we try to do something a little different every year. And this year we are looking into stories about themes around light and dark, life and death, stories of wildlife biology, of people who love this place and have lived or worked here for a long time. And then I mentioned we went to the counter assault bear spray factory, because we're looking into a history of bear spray. So it'll be a little more eclectic mix of topics that are tied together by themes of light and dark, life and death.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Neat. I'm interested to hear the bear spray episode. That's going to be...
Yeah, stay tuned.
Was that one fun to research?
It has been.
I've just been hearing tidbits sort of coming over the cubicle wall.
Yeah, I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, and it was really interesting to learn that, in the early research that was conducted into the application of deterrence for bears in the early 80s, they were trying all sorts of things, just throwing stuff at the wall, seeing what would stick. And they were testing this on problem bears that had been captured here in Glacier because they were getting into food or getting into campsites. There was one bear named Growly. And after Growly was the, subject of all of these various deterrent tests, Growly was sent to the zoo in Columbus, Ohio, where he lived until 2002, and I probably met him. I went to that zoo all the time when I was little, so it was really a really neat connection to make.
That's awesome. Are you going to try to put that in the podcast somehow?
I'm going to try to.
That's a great thing to put in there.
Yeah.
Just one last question for you guys. You've been working on this for a few years. What do you think makes podcasts such a good tool for telling stories about Glacier?
I think one of my favorite things about it is that, first of all, it's kind of larger scale than a lot of other interpretive products you might encounter, like a video or a social media post or a web page. We have 45 minutes or even an hour to kind of have a conversation with our listeners, and much more if you're thinking about the space of a whole season. And I think my favorite thing about it is that it leaves space for us not to answer all the questions. We pose a lot of questions. You hear from a ton of different people, but you don't have to tie it up in a bow. You can kind of ask the listeners to draw their own conclusions. I think there's space for that in podcasting that there isn't always in other media or other forms of interpretation. Sometimes there is, but yeah, that's, I think, my favorite part of podcasting.
Makes you think.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, we've been really fortunate. We've found an audience. Over 20,000 people have listened to Headwaters in the last few years. And as Peri alluded to, they stick around for, over 80% on average of these hour-long episodes. And I think a big part of the reason why it works so well is this phrase I heard once that's really stuck with me is emotion happens in your ears. Like audio captures the feelings of these people we're introducing our listeners to that they would have never met on a visit to Glacier. And that's really powerful. It connects them to this place in a way that they might not have had the chance when they were visiting for 2 days. And meeting these scientists that are planting whitebark pine seedlings, or historians who are researching the history of people here during the Ice Age. So, it's a really great opportunity for us, just to have a great job, but for listeners on the other end to get a deeper understanding and to connect to this place in a really meaningful way. And so I think that's why podcasts work so well, is they're a really effective tool for communicating emotion. I think it bears repeating, we are, this entire project is made possible by the Glacier National Park Conservancy and donations to them. They're a phenomenal resource and have been incredibly supportive over the years. We also mentioned the park archives and our cultural resources staff, including archaeologists. This doesn't happen just with Peri and I. We're two members of a 4-person team.
And so many people have contributed over the years too. Gabby and Daniel are the current members of the team, but Darren Lewis helped research it. Renata Harrison did a bunch of research. There have been other members of the media team over the years. Andrew helped
Smith,
host season 1. There's so many people that go into this that you don't see here today, but also that you may never hear in your ears, even if you listen to the whole show. So yeah, it's so many people have made this possible.
All right, well, thanks for joining us today, guys. You can listen to Headwaters wherever you get your podcasts. In addition to Michael and Peri, Daniel Lombardi and Gabby Echeverry are also on the Headwaters podcasting team. Find out more information about Headwaters by visiting the Glacier National Park Conservancy's website at glacier.org/headwaters. Now it's time to take a look at what events are coming up this week. Remember, you can find karaoke nights, art classes, live music, and anything community related by going to dailyinterlake.com/events. And for business owners and event organizers out there, it is totally free to sign up and start posting your events for the entire region to see on our events calendar. The Center for Native Plants will host Danny Olson with the Flathead Audubon Society on August 17th. Olson will talk about the value of birds to us, the value of native plants to birds, the value of native birds to plants, and the anthropod glue that joins them. He will share some of his favorite bird stories and may break into his notorious bird song mimicry. No registration is required. The event starts at 6 p.m. at the Center for Native Plants in Whitefish. The River Street Festival in Superior takes place on August 19th. There will be a farmer's market, cornhole tournament, paddleboard race, live entertainment, and more. Find out more information at riverstreetfest.com. And join the Flathead Jazz Society for their annual summer dance, featuring the Flathead Valley's own Don Lawrence Orchestra. There will be swing dancing to the sounds of big band music on August 20th at the Eagles Club Ballroom in Kalispell. Tickets can be purchased at the door, $10 for singles and $12 for couples. The event runs from 4 to 7 p.m. Thanks for joining us. News Now is a podcast from the Daily Interlake. We're proud to be the largest independent newsroom in Montana and the oldest paper in the Valley. Consider becoming a subscriber to support our work. Call Circulation at 406-755-7018 or go to the subscribe tab in the top right corner of our website. And if you haven't already, subscribe to our YouTube channel to never miss an episode of the pod. Everybody stay safe and have a great week.